before everyone goes to their next gig, I'm compelled to say a few things. So I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to thank the proprietors, proprietress in charge, and Dan. Trish Triumfo, I like that name. Sullivan. I also want to thank Heidi Feldman and Heidi Feldman. Where's Heidi? There's Heidi. Aaron Arajo, helping set up the event today and make the food and inspire me and to put my thoughts down in writing. Or my history, not my history, the history of Salinas, and things that I observed and experienced since I moved here in 1970. So a lot of it was, people mainly know me as a campaign manager. I ran 70 campaigns. Wow. I also worked on many issues like housing discrimination, the war in Vietnam, the draft, building a park in Carr Lake. There were many issues outside of the electoral realm that I worked on when I lived here, and some were successful, some were partially successful, some weren't successful. Of those 70 campaigns, I think I won 45 and won 25. I've lost 25. Not bad if you're a pitcher in the major leagues.
You can't say you lost it because you would have made a difference.
Well, sometimes losing, there's certain battles you have to fight whether you win or lose, right?
Exactly.
And obviously we don't win them all. We have and actually in Salinas here, for a number of reasons, including sort of the civil rights movement in Salinas, which I think many of us remember who are old timers, Jesse Sanchez and Juan Oliveras and Ernesto Gonzalez and others who led the way toward districting in Salinas. And when it was put to a vote, voters voted for it, and Salinas was diversified their leadership from like all white downtown businessmen to a mix that reflected the city. And though that lawsuit was brought by Latinos, it also benefited women candidates, Filipino candidates, African American candidates. So at one point, I think there was, on the city council, there were 6 women and 1 man. Probably the best council they've had. But anyway, I think there's many things I was proud of and some things I should apologize for in having pushed people to do things. And I'll mention one, which was Mr. Struve, who still owns the Struve family, owns the mortuary here. One of the Struve family members was the head of the draft board, which was a block away from his mortuary. And at the time, we had an anti-war office upstairs above First Awakenings, and that's a whole nother long story. But we routinely picketed the draft board, and one day we decided to picket the mortuary, that it was a conflict of interest for a mortician to be on the draft board.
Good point.
Boy, did that piss him off. And I sort of regret it in a way, even though years later I understood that he came out against the draft, even though he'd been appointed by Richard Nixon to be the head of the draft board here in Salinas. So they were a good family, and he was a good man. During World War II, his family, when the Japanese Americans in Salinas were sent off to Poston, Arizona, for the war, the Struve family took care of the Japanese cemetery for nothing. They went out, the family went out there and kept the graves clean. And that cemetery, if nobody's been there, it's like out Abbott Street. And there's a whole chapter in the book about cemeteries. So you can read it if you want, or you can skip it. But I found it fascinating, which is something Heidi knows. Wherever we go, I like to go to cemeteries. Okay, so, but I think it tells you something about a town. Hi guys. How people are buried, and here, of course, they're segregated. We have a Chinese cemetery, a Japanese cemetery, a Potter's Field. Hey, the Ocampos are here.
Hi, see you, Sandra.
So, a lot of you folks are in this book. If you're not in there by name, you're in there in spirit. Anything I did, I couldn't have done. I couldn't have done without.
All right.
It was always a matter of organizing all the volunteers to do things. So I always had to put the squeeze on people. You know, either to give money or to give time. And if I didn't do that, things weren't going to happen. And if you didn't volunteer, things didn't happen. So
Thank
you all for that.
Thank you for your leadership and your big heart, Gary. Your big heart. You don't turn around. You don't turn away from a hard fight when your heart is in it.
Well,
And that is admirable.
the thing that was the hardest for me in this town was the housing issue. When I got trained to be an organizer, and with renters. This is like 1979, 1980, and we tried to pass a rent control ordinance. The realtors beat us up. We didn't, of course, we were all amateurs, right? We didn't know how to run a campaign. It was the first campaign I ever ran, and I really didn't, the whole time I'm saying, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do this. But over time, I learned how to run campaigns. The other thing that happened when we tried to organize renters, we had to lobby the elected officials. And on one issue, there was a big problem in Salinas with housing for folks with children, a lot of people with children. Many landlords wouldn't rent to families with children. So there was a bill in the state legislature which our parent organization said, well, we've got to push on Henry Mello, who was our state senator at the time. You got to push Henry Mello, because he's a swing vote in a subcommittee, to get this bill out of committee on the floor that will prohibit discrimination against families with children. So we were putting the heat on them, you know, and we decided to go a little bit farther and put an ad in the paper, which, if people remember newspapers, back then, if you were looking for an apartment, they were all listed in the newspaper. So we put an ad in the apartments for rent section that says, have children having a problem finding housing, call this number. So it was Henry Mello's number.
Wow.
So we ran that for a couple of weeks, and then
That's a good idea.
Henry Mello's assistant,
Let's make note of that idea.
Henry Mello's chief of staff, Kathy O'Boyle, called me up and said, hey, did you put that ad in the paper? I said, well, yes, Kathy, we did. She said, well, we got a lot of calls. And she said, I'm going to let Senator Mello know that it's more of a problem than we thought. So with some more, you know, leaning on the guy, finally voted for the bill. This was like 1979. So that's one minor success, but it was a big deal for a lot of people. The other one was trying to get them to not discriminate against people of color. And we found that there was a problem, and we worked with another group, and we trained people to be testers, where we take a Latino couple, an African American couple, and a white couple. And we take the ads in the paper and we call them, and we'd say, oh, hi, I'm looking to see you have an apartment. Can we come over and take a look? And so they'd say, oh yeah, come on over. So we'd send the African American couple or the Latino couple, and not all the time, but sometimes when they got there, the landlord or the property person would say, oh, I'm sorry, we just rented it. So we had to bust a few people to get the word out that somebody's watching what you're doing. We did that for multiple weekends, and it seemed to sink in with the real estate people that somebody's watching what they're doing. They either need to be more clever or stop doing what they're doing and rent to people who need a place to rent. So again, both were somewhat successful, but like everything else in our society, you have a success and then it doesn't last. the other side decides to try another way to get around all your rules, you know, all the protections, the social safety net. But we felt we had some success, at least temporarily. So, but that working in that position, I actually got trying to organize renters. That was the worst thing I ever did. I mean, I had my camera busted. I had guns pulled on me. I got cops called because I was trespassing. Of course I'm trespassing. You know, I was trespassing a lot, so I had cops called on me all the time, which not so bad. But anyway, that was all. I thought, this is really hard work. I don't know am I getting anywhere with this, or this is just all in vain, you know? So, you know, there's, again, you're saying, we talked earlier about some fights that need to be fought, even though you may not win big wins. There may be an incremental win. You take what you can get, you stick at it. Perseverance and resourcefulness are the two characteristics of a good organizer. Someone who's can make do with what you got, which may be next to nothing. Olga's good at that. I learned from people like Olga. So anyway, I stuck my 2 cents in and stuck with it. So, but I did it with all you. Wasn't like I'm not the Lone Ranger or anything like that. You know, there's no such thing. And a lot of this book is about love of place. It's not about organizing. It's about this is a wonderful town. There's a lot of good things here. It took me a while to realize that I didn't know anything about the mountains, the soil, the sky, the earth, the river. I mean, things that we just sort of, you can live in a place and not know. So, you know, I made an adventure out of it. I learned a little bit about the makeup of the Salinas Valley, and I'm glad I did. So thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for helping us all change the town we love. Thank you.
Wonderful. A lot of people have come in since you started talking. We know him well.
Hi. Wow.
Yes.
Well,
Glenn and Kathy are here.
So I must thank you guys many times, because we've worked together quite a bit. And I know a lot of us may have had arguments, and so what the hell? I mean, nobody's perfect. First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming. We had an event like this in Salinas last weekend. We had 40 or 50 people. Part of the, and many of you may have seen the exhibits that Juan Martinez and Karen and I have done with the previous book that we wrote, the oral histories. But that's a whole long story of how we collected that and the stories that it tells. So first of all, I want to thank Heidi for making sure that I got up and got dressed and got here today. And made sure to eat some food. And the cauliflower is take home. It was picked yesterday. And so I also want to thank Karen, where's Karen? Karen, for being the greeter tonight. Thank you, Karen.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Karen. You're very welcome.
So tonight we have the book I've just finished, Along Came the Whirlwind. I also have some copies of Voices of Change and some of these little pamphlets by Fred Ross Jr. with Woody Guthrie and Fred Ross Sr. on the front. Fred Ross Sr. was an organizer who trained by Saul Alinsky, and then trained people how to organize. And I was thinking, the one little episode I want to read today, first, before I forget, I want to acknowledge so the book is dedicated to 4 people, 2 of which are here. I'd like to have them step forward. That would be Vivian and Romy Triplett.
Yay!
dedicated to these two girls, Vivian and Romy, and my other two grandchildren who aren't here, Joshua, who's 10 months, and Kiana, who's 11, who's in North Carolina. So, next generation. Thank you, girls. So, I think what I'm going to do, part of what this book is about, 4 things. It's about love of place and how people sort of get attached to a place. It's about activism, trying to change the world either dramatically or, proportionally, a step at a time. Also, what's in the book is there's a walking tour of Salinas. So a walking tour, you can get your book and do it yourself. Or if you want, I'll lead a tour. We'll get some people together, which is a little more fun. And then, if you like that kind of thing, I think it isn't a very long, but it's downtown Salinas, and there's plenty to see and talk about. And the last thing is just the constant fight over history itself, which we're in the middle of always. People are always fighting over history. Whether to allow ethnic studies classes at San Francisco State in the 1960s, how do you be inclusive, and then you've got this phony backlash from who and all those folks about that their history is getting erased because we're trying to include our history. It's not just but for me, I loved history. I was a history major, and when I got to college and after college and during the Vietnam War, I realized, shit, I've been lied to. Big time, really lied to. And so I had to expunge some of that and then sort of relearn the American story, I think, that included people that weren't in the history books, that weren't the Lone Ranger and all of the superheroes of the Old West, good guys, bad guys stuff. And that's an ongoing, and there are lots of books about the Salinas Valley and Monterey County that are pretty much hunky-dory kind of histories. They're like happy, everyone's happy, and it's like plantations history, stuff. I mean, not to really ding this too much, but books like this, they tend to just be hunky-dory kind of histories. These are Acadia books. I mean, there's a lot of them. I mean, it's good to have these, but they really don't take on, they're all postcards anyway, this one, but if you read the histories that were commissioned by, like the grower shippers, etc., it's their story, right? Farm workers are sort of incidental tools. I mean, it's like who built the pyramids? Who did build the pyramids? Pharaohs? Of course not. So, but it's worth continuing to push back on that history, and we know that's happening nationally. And I know tomorrow night at MSNBC there's with Henry Louis Gates and others, they're going to talk about the Civil War and slavery. And the kind of reckoning the country just can't seem to get to, or not enough people who don't want to, who can't, or they have a history that I was taught, and I think most of us were as children back in the day, that it was, certain things happened and it was like manifest destiny. It was, colonialism was okay. It was, because we were good people. Hi, Patricia. I was going to thank you, but you weren't here.
It's Patricia.
I want to thank Patricia Hamilton, my publisher, and 2 books. She's very good at what she does, and if you have a story to tell, talk to Patricia and see if she's the right person for you. Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. And so I'm going to read a quick story, and then we'll take some time to just talk about our own histories. I know many of us have been around for a while, so we've got a song to sing and a story to tell. The first thing to mention Well, first of all, I want to just, this exhibit here, it's not as good as I could have done. And there's more of this, and many of you may have seen this. Juan Martinez and I have a collection of things that relate to different movements in Monterey County, and throughout, many of them were, what happened in Monterey County is part of a national movement, like the National Organization for Women, the Equal Rights Amendment and all that. There was activities here along that front. And of course, economic democracy with the labor unions, especially the United Farm Workers Union, and other movements that we've had in local activities and activists and organizers. So, speaking of Fred Ross, here he uses that. Some axioms for organizers. This is a cute little book. It's got lots of just quick reminders of how to organize, how to be an activist. And some of them are real simple. That's what it's not, they're how you do a step-by-step campaign that involves basically volunteers and people who have busy lives and but are being discriminated against or in other ways oppressed. So the one axiom is reminding is an essential tool of organizing. So another way to say that is from Fred Ross Sr., 90% of organizing is follow-up. So I'm going to read a page here where we actually did that and it made a difference. In the late 80s, there was, in the middle of Salinas, there's some farmland that's called Carr Lake. Right? Many people, you drive past it on Laurel Drive, you're in the Tiverton Hospital. And in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there were movements among the citizenry to make a park out of it. And, you know, boosted up so Salinas was, had not enough acres per 100,000 people. There just wasn't enough outdoor activities for people to go, and Carr Lake looked like it is now being gradually and slowly turned into a park with help from the Big Sur Land Trust. But back then, the Big Sur Land Trust was not involved, and it was, at one point, the city of Salinas put a measure was floating a measure to have a bond, assessment district to pay for it. So here's what we did to try to convince the city council that they should go ahead and assess property owners to buy the land and make a park. In the late 80s, a campaign to make this area a regional park picked up steam among the denizens. The city proposed a citywide property assessment district to pay for the land, a tax. An opposition developed. Meetings became more contentious. The opponents of the park tended to be older, whiter, and long-term property owners. The supporters of the park tended to be younger, Latino, and renters. Soccer teams were big supporters. The city scheduled 3 meetings to hear from the community. The first meeting was scheduled and the opponents showed up in good numbers and showed up early, as older people tend to do. I was younger then. I'm older than that now. We were caught off guard and were outnumbered. The first meeting was a setback for us, for the park. So the proponents needed to mobilize the community for the next meeting, but we needed a plan. The next community meeting was in a week, so we got organizers, we got on the phones and began calling people to get commitments to attend. We needed to pack the room this time. The room was at Hebron Heights, and I went to check actually, would seat 80 people, and the meeting would start at 6 p.m. The organizers, us, were guessing the opponents would arrive before 6 to make sure that they got a seat. So the organizers, supporters of the park began calling supporters and extracting promises that they would attend, bring family and friends, and arrive no later than 5:30. By the day before the meeting, we had commitments that 90 people would attend and be there before 5:30. That day, before the community meeting, the organizers made reminder calls. Hoping supporters could be counted on to attend was not enough. Reminder calls were required to demonstrate the importance that each person be there and be on time. The day of the meeting, the organizers arrived at 5. City staff already had the chairs set up. Our supporters began to arrive at 5:15, coming straight from work. By 5:45, we had not only filled the hall and filled every seat, but had filled the parking lot. We held our seats. And I remember making sure people, if you got up to go to the bathroom, hold that seat. So as the opponents began to arrive, they were delayed because of the lack of parking. And they were finally able to enter the hall. All the seats were taken. A win for the park. Consequently, the speakers at the microphone tended to be 10-to-1 pro park. Next step, plan to do the same thing at the next community meeting. So we didn't actually change anybody's mind, we just got there first. So, small trick, in the long run we lost in 1989. But now, with the help of different city council and with the Big Sur Land Trust, they're purchasing the land from the 3 Japanese-American farmers who farmed that land since they came back from internment camps in 1945. So that's just one little story about what's in here. And there's some, I think there's some good writing in here, and there's also some writing that's probably not so good. And there's one major typo, but if you find it. But nonetheless, I think it holds together. I mean, it actually, the story starts before I moved out here. I worked in Salinas, and then even since I moved to Pacific Grove, I've still been working in Salinas on campaigns through the Democratic Party mainly. Recently, the recall, Karen and I and others against the recall.
Gary, how come you lost the park?
Well, because the city, the third meeting was in a hall we just couldn't pack. We couldn't use the same trick. And like the Trumpers and the Tea Party people, they yelled and screamed a lot. And they just, the city council got cold feet. So they backed off. And that was 1989, so there was another attempt in 2002 to get, people to build a movement for the park. But recently, this Big Sur Land Trust actually came in with the kind of organizational persistence, I guess, that organizations have when they're so dedicated to buy the land and then and get it developed so that it works for flood control as well as for recreational uses. And with that park, and with the extensions that it already has along the creeks, it would be almost as big as Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. Wow. It would be one of the largest parks in the United States. And you wouldn't know it by looking at it, but you have to take in, imagine, Wes, you go up Gavilan Creek, you go up Natividad Creek, you go up Alisal Creek, you have Cesar Chavez Park, you put all that greenery in that open space together, and it's a pretty large area. Wow. It's a pretty large area. So, hoping to see that at some point. That's all from me for now.
Encore. Can you listen some more from the book? Would you like to read a little
What
more?
about the renters? What about your first endeavor?
Oh, with renters?
Rent control.
There was 2 of them. Which one?
I don't know, you told the story at the last one. Whatever you're moved to share.
Well, see, when I moved, we opened the Peace Center in Salinas in 1971 and closed in 72. It was about a year and a half. It was, in part, we got evicted. We got evicted for
being peaceful.
Yeah,
What we did is we used to routinely pick at the draft board. And we realized that the guy who was chairman of the draft board ran a mortuary across the street from the draft board. So one time we decided, well, we're going to call the meeting, we're going to pick at the mortuary because it's a conflict of interest. He shouldn't be on the draft board, and sending people to Vietnam, and he's running a business of, that he does. So it was Mr. Struve, the Struve and Laporte mortuary. And they're still there. Yeah, they've been there, and this is sort of. So we went to pick at his mortuary, and of course he was mad as hell. It pissed him off, and his older brother, father, somebody had been mayor years ago. He was one of the town fathers. We were just a bunch of punks, 24 years old. We didn't really think about the consequences. The consequences were stop the war, okay? And whether we get evicted, we got evicted because he got the city to go evict us out of our office, right? So that was sort of the end of it. But I found out later that Mr. Struve and his family took care of the Japanese cemetery for free during World War II while the Japanese were interned on posts in Arizona. After the draft was terminated in the mid-70s, and there was an effort to start it again, Jimmy Carter brought that up. I was asked to speak at a town hall about whether pro or con with the draft, and I said, well, I'm still against the draft, and I'll speak about it. And the person that called me from the ACLU said, well, who can we get to speak in favor of the draft? I said, well, try Mr. Struve. He used to be the president of the board. So I never heard back from that person with the ACLU, and I saw him later, and I said, well, what happened to Mr. Struve? Didn't you ever get a speaker to come speak in favor of the draft? He goes, no, I called Mr. Struve like you suggested, and he wanted to speak against the draft. So I thought, well, I wonder if he changed his mind, even though he got us evicted. I don't know. But then I realized later, got a little more history, and I realized, well, his family, they were good people. Right? He was a Republican. He was appointed by Nixon to be on the draft board. But, he took care of the Japanese cemetery, and that really touched me. So I sort of felt bad, now that I'm older, about picketing his mortuary, when I realized, well, maybe I should have talked to him first. Anyway, so it's hard to tell how people's minds change.
Maybe it had impact.
Pardon?
Maybe it had impact. Maybe you connecting those two had impact.
Yeah, well, I would like to think that, even though it was an affront, it wasn't polite, it was a little bit rough around the edges to do, and I'm not sure we thought it through all the way, but what the hell.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I was wondering who was your biggest influence, or was it an event to get you started on your activism path?
Well, I grew up on the West Coast, We had a soundtrack going in our heads, right? With whether it was Bob Dylan, the Grateful Dead, Joan Baez, Quicksilver Messenger Service, there was definitely a soundtrack to what we were doing. And there was a cause, it was a big cause. It wasn't just one cause, it was a whole bunch of causes. Prison reform, rights for women, everything you can think of. It was like a more extended civil rights movement that just blossomed all over the country. But probably when I was listening to Joan Baez and her husband David Harris, who was part of the resistance and went to jail for 2 years. But I would say there were two people, beside friends of mine, girlfriends and other male friends of mine who were doing the same thing I was. it was Muhammad Ali and Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
So, but, that's about it. Actually, it's sort of, I must say this, I mean, sometimes, of course, actions antidote to despair. It's pretty fucking hard to not despair some days, you know? I mean, especially if you think the things that many of us did for the last 50, 60 years. There's a big attempt to roll back all of that. And basically go back to, basically oppressive, undo democracy, undo all the gains that people have made, So, but I guess it's, and at the time, I mean, in the early 70s, it seemed like we were on a roll, we were going to win. Abortion was legalized. We were getting ethnic studies programs. The farm workers were winning contracts. There was reform movements in prisons. I mean, but there was, it just seemed like things were going our way, that the world was changing, and we could just, all it would take was a couple more years of activism and the world would be fine, right?
Yeah.
But then when you're at 20-nothing years old, it looks that way. But it was a sad time too. I mean, a lot of our leaders were killed and people were killed in prison. And I mean, some people who, like, the two of the authors who lived in Monterey County for a long time, one of which was killed. And you don't even think of them as authors, but George Jackson and Eldridge Cleaver. They both lived in Soledad Prison. And they wrote books, and so they're local authors. I mean, George Jackson, I don't know if anybody remembers that, but he was one of the Soledad brothers, and that's part of what I think made Salinas and the Salinas Valley and the Monterey area so vibrant with activism, because of the prison, the fort, and it feels. And there were people, GIs, inmates, and farm workers who were all, we want more. It's not right what you're doing. So, enough so that the FBI opened an office in Salinas, which you wouldn't think they would normally have an office in Salinas, and they would come over to our Peace Center just to see what we were doing, if we had any runaway girls. They would say that actually, sort of like stupid. But I didn't have much, I didn't think that FBI guys were very smart, the ones I ran into, but they would come over and harass us just to see if we had any escaped convicts or anything. Like, they would say that, we're looking for an escaped convict, and I'm going, well, they're not here right now.
And that's why they came back.
So, and just to get, again, what I was telling earlier about, I mean, when I refused induction into the Army, they made you talk to an FBI agent. He's trying to convince me to take the oath and go in the Army, and I figured, well, okay, man, well, if you can try to convince me to do that, I can try to convince you to quit your job and do something meaningful. So I did. I'm not going to just sit there. I mean, so he threw me out of his office. So when they had the FBI office in Salinas, they would come over. And, and they no doubt were looking, from the other building for binoculars, I don't know, but it wasn't just us, because there were other peace groups and anti-war groups, and even the Chavez, I mean, they didn't think that, trying to prove he's a communist and all this kind of stuff. I mean, and what was going on in the prisons, and the support groups that were active in supporting inmates and their rights. So we started going to the FBI office, and they were upstairs in the post office, and you could get there and go up and knock on their door and ask them, how's it going, and did you find those escaped convicts yet? They weren't very, I don't know, maybe these guys were like trainees or something. They just weren't very good at what they were doing, I didn't think, but so there was anyway, we had to just kind of relationship with some of these folks. But so after a couple of years, I went out and worked in the fields, and didn't cut cauliflower, but it was really rough work. I couldn't do it today, I'll tell you. I couldn't do it. I was telling Heidi the other day, because we'd get up at 4 in the morning, put your clothes in the oven, put on warm, and go back to bed, and then get up, hopefully before you burn your clothes, so you can get in your clothes and go out and go to work. But I have these knives here. This is the kind of knives they use. This is lettuce. This is celery. Each one's for a different crop. But this I better stop talking. But this is an interesting photo, and this was these 4 people. Dolores Huerta. This is in Salinas in 1970 when Cesar Chavez was in jail for not calling off the boycott of banana, I think, mid-1970. And he was supposed to turn himself in. The old jail was downtown Salinas. And so I think it was, according to Juan Martinez, there was like 700 people that marched from the Union Hall to the jail where Cesar turned himself in. And then a month or two later, they let him go, a day before Christmas. And during that time period, some of the people that came were Ethel Kennedy, Coretta Scott King, and that's a whole nother, because they weren't treated very well, even though these are, both their husbands were assassinated. They came here to support Cesar Chavez. So Dolores Huerta, Ethel Kennedy, thank you. This gentleman, Larry Itzleon, was the head of the Filipino farm workers, who actually went on a strike before the Mexican farm workers did, with Cesar Chavez. And Robert Garcia, who's still around, he lives in Salinas. He was Cesar's bodyguard. And he used to harass me all the time because he thought I was a communist. And Cesar didn't like communists. And I wasn't a communist because I didn't believe in the Communist Party. But anyway, anybody who's a radical, today they talk about the Trumpers being radicalized. I was radicalized. I think many people were, if you all of a sudden realize that your culture isn't all it's been cracked up to be. So,
All in favor, say aye.
Gary, I have another question. As a historian, how do you feel about today's times and what we're learning, and are you hopeful?
well, I'm hopeful, but some days it's pretty sad. It's hard to, there's, all we can do is keep up the fight. It's, there's always, you can't let the forces of regression were developed as soon as we were in the middle of this in the early 70s with it was called the Powell memo, I think, or something. Maybe it knows that for more than many. But they developed a whole strategy, which they've been taking 50 years to implement slowly, to undo everything from Brown versus Board of Education to Roe versus Wade versus all the civil rights legislation and voting rights legislation. They set out a plan to basically undo all that, and they had the money, obviously, because people on their side are money more so than people on our side.
But the young people, we've seen young people in the streets, we've seen BLM, we've seen so much that
That's where the hope is.
Yeah, and old people, they're still kicking.
They're still
Got
kicking.
plenty of energy.
They're still kicking. Well, and part of what I want to do with the books I don't sell is to take them to the high schools
Great.
and community colleges. And any proceeds from these books I'm going to donate to the Friends of the Salinas Library. I'm glad you're all here. So I'm going to have to go to the high schools. It's the only way I'm going to catch 18-year-olds. If I want to and I spoke in a couple of classes at CSUB 2 or 3 weeks ago, and all 18, 19-year-olds.
Yeah.
And basically, They were intrigued, they were interested. I mean, I don't know if they knew a lot of the history, but they were certainly interested and they asked good questions. But, I mean, I wanted to make sure that young people today know that, you know, they may have a fight on their hands, that they are going to have a fight on their hands. And everything you do is, you know, all of this stuff is basically in self-defense. You know, we're all trying to defend our rights as a person, as a family, as a community. And we do it together. One more thank you. So for 50 years, I've been asking people for their time and their money, so thank you. Okay, Sylvia.
Well, looking at the letters, it comes to mind, is there any possibility that the Salinas Valley, the farm workers, can form a farm worker co-op and own something and work for themselves?
Well, there is some of that happening, but it's, let's see,
San Gerardo?
it's down, not San Gerardo. San Gerardo is a cooperative, that's a housing cooperative. But down that same road, there's another Alba, right? Agricultural land-based, where farm workers learn how to be small farmers. But it's small farming, and it's a slow process. And, but so there's some of that going on, but it's probably hard to get into farming because it's very expensive business to run.
Anyway.
That's what I know about. I mean, there are ag programs, and when you read about agriculture, it all seems like they're trying to mechanize everything and make it so there's no more people involved.
Silicon Valley's involved in it now.
Pardon me?
Silicon
Oh,
Valley's
Silicon Valley.
involved in farming.
Well, part of the fight back in the day too was to fight mechanization, especially when it was being all of the work was being paid for by UC Davis, public money. Like for example, to build a tomato harvester. But to build a tomato harvester that would work, they had to build a tomato that could be picked by the tomato harvester. So to do that, they had to gene pool, they had to mix with the genes of the tomato. I mean, you may have noticed that tomatoes at some point, all of a sudden, they didn't look right, they didn't taste right. I mean, that tomato started to look like a baseball, right?
You could use it for
and then what used to be tomatoes were called heirlooms. So UC Davis, they spent money, they developed a machine that would pick this new tomato, and without smashing it, and without people, basically very few people, guy driving the thing. It had less nutrition, it cost more, it didn't taste as good. It did away with farm workers and small growers, so because buying the machine was very expensive. So basically, it had no. It was not good for public money to be paying for something that was going to have so many negative effects. But you know, and some things apparently just can't be mechanized. But there's attempts to, you know, I mean, farm workers have power right now, I think, not necessarily collectively, which would be better if they had it collectively and they could get a contract that includes benefits. But right now, workers as a whole have some say, but there's no one, but it's not organized. I mean, it's just, well, I can walk away. You know, I can go, I can dictate my terms, perhaps, as an individual. But when you read this contract that was signed by the United Farmers Union with Interharvest, which is one of the biggest companies back in the 70s, you see all the benefits that people got. I mean, even a small raise was enough to break into the middle class for farm workers with benefits, and the other things they got, like restrictions on pesticide use, were written into the contract. You know? So. But that took 15,000 people walking off the job and staying off the job and calling boycotts of lettuce and other things. So that kind of movement is more effective than individuals trying to negotiate you know, a pay raise or something.
In regards to that, does it matter if they're undocumented now?
Pardon me?
Does it matter if they're undocumented now?
Well, it's certainly holding people back. I mean, honestly, not to go, yeah, it's better to be, get the documents. I mean, we did that once in 1986, which was the comprehensive immigration reform Ronald Reagan signed. Republicans realized it was a big mistake, and they don't want to ever do that again, which is allow, in this case, 11 million people who may want to become citizens. What are they going to do? They're going to vote. What did they do last time? They voted. What happened? Republicans are a third party in the state of California, right? After they denigrated, when they done this in waves, Republicans basically, you know, demonizing Mexicans and others, that, you know, folks don't forget. And when they had a chance and they became a citizen, they registered either as a Democrat or an independent, and they voted out the Republicans. And I think they realized that would happen again if they passed comprehensive, if we were able to pass a comprehensive immigration reform. And, you know, in terms of feeling wanted, I mean, part of what's in the book too is the sense of belonging in a place. And when you're undocumented, or, you know, you're just a hired hand, like you don't have any real roots. It's hard to settle down. You don't want to be a migrant. You want to stay somewhere and raise a family and you know, do better. So most of, you know, the growers went places to find people. They wanted them to work, but they didn't want them to stay. You know, they went to high schools in Manila. They ran radio ads in Mexico. They distributed handbills in Oklahoma. They brought people out here, treated them like shit, and basically said, you know, keep moving, man, keep moving.
So was the Rosero program a good program or not? The one that,
Well,
where they came here for the summer or the
sort of a
harvest?
mixed bag because of they were under contract and they had very little contact with the outside world once they got here, and they were quite dependent on the grower they worked for everything. And there was a lot of mistreatment. There was a lot of accidents, including a bus accident in Chular in 1963 that killed 32 Braceros, which basically was like, that's it, Congress ended the Bracero program the next year. That was Chular, just south of Salinas. That's where this Memorial Highway sign is. That in the 50th anniversary of that bus crash, several people got to, Juan Martinez was the lead. Raised $10,000 and got permission to get this sign put up. Two of them actually south of Salinas. It's the only, as far as I know, there's some parks and schools named after Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, but in terms of workers in general, there's not a thing. Tell me a place where the working class is memorialized. You know, to Robert E. Lee, or, you know, General Sherman, or, you know, even if it's, you know, one of our, I mean, it's just like working people don't get noticed. You know, they build all the stuff and then, you know, so.
Gary, isn't there a well-known song about this incident?
Yes.
I'll try to think of what it is.
Woody Guthrie.
Yes.
Los Gatos Canyon. Woody Guthrie, right? About a plane that went down for sale. And so many people in Salinas that I know have, their father or grandfather was a Bracero. I mean, so many people who came up here to work between 1942 and 1964. In 1942, Franklin Roosevelt went to Mexico. He flew to Mexico to talk to the Mexican president. He said, look, we're shipping 15 million people overseas to fight fascism, so we need your help. And this is after we deported all these Mexicans during the Depression, you know. But Roosevelt was smart. He went to Mexico. He flew there and talked to the president and said, we want to set up a program where workers, men, all men, could come up under contract and work during the war in the fields, in the farms, and the railroads, so that we can maximize the war effort. We'll be part of the fight against fascism as an ally, right? So they did that but when the war ended, they continued it because the growers liked it. But it was way overdue to be done away with, and because it's hard to organize. It was Cesar Chavez's early work was trying to organize workers who were American citizens, but they were always getting out-competed by braceros who were brought up from Mexico, and they were supposed to, the farmers were supposed to hire locals first, but they weren't doing that because they could push these people around easier than local people who could walk off or go talk to the labor commissioner or something.
Yeah.
So I would say I wouldn't start that program up again. I would just, we just document 11 million people.
Right.
Very good.
Are you ready to sign your books?
Yes. So, thank you, everybody.
The farmer patrol.
There you go.
Does everybody know this? Klaus? Klausen?